Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for braving the weather. And I think you will find your decision was wise, because we are so honored to have an extremely special guest back again at Roosevelt House for the second time. First, I want to acknowledge the presence of some of the members of Roosevelt House's Board of Advisors. Elbrin Kimmelman is here, Tony Stepansky is there, and Greg Shufro is somewhere. There's Greg, right there. So welcome to everyone. Our special guest, who was here last fall as incoming chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. As you all know, Jerry Nadler is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. He was also Brooklyn-born, educated at Stuyvesant High School, Columbia College, and Fordham Law School. Member of the New York State Assembly. Earlier than that, a Manhattan district leader. I always tell people I first covered Jerry on the campaign trail when I was a beginning reporter 50 years ago this year. A little scary, but we're still standing, so it's good. He has a special record in electoral politics. He was elected twice to the U.S. House of Representatives on the same day. I remember that day well. Why, you may ask? Because he was elected in a special election to fill out the term of a congressman who had passed away, and having been nominated to run in the general election also, he ran that on that very same day for Congress. So he was elected twice on the same day. You don't get that outside of Texas too much, and has been elected 12 times since. He has been a leading New York progressive for many, many years, a voice for change, for equality in Albany, in Washington, on the West Side, and throughout New York City. It's a real honor to welcome Chairman Jerry Nadler.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's good to be back in New York for a few weeks after being in Washington for a long time. Let me just say I have to comment on that special election because it was very unusual. I was running in a regular election on November 3rd or whatever it was for a 2-year term beginning in January, and in a special election for the 7 remaining weeks of the term to which Ted Weiss had been elected 2 years earlier, but he had passed away. Now, normally in a special election, the governor calls the special election, and you read a little article, governor calls election from, April 3rd or whatever. There's a little provision in the New York election law that nobody knows about that says that if the vacancy occurs in a narrow time window, there's automatically a special election on the same day as the general election, and the governor doesn't call it. Well, the Republicans that year didn't notice that there was a special election. So I was the only candidate on the ballot in the special election. I got 100% of the vote in the special election. But I was also on the ballot with a Republican opponent in the regular election. It was a very heavily Democratic district, as it still is, but we were concerned that the only way I could conceivably lose the election was if several thousand people walked in, voted for me in the special election, figured they did their job, didn't vote in the regular election, and walked out. So we issued literature. We put out literature all over the place, and I still remember the slogan we invented. It said, quote, big headline, "You always wanted to vote twice. Now you can, in fact, you must." And enough people did, so we won both elections. Anyway, you have probably seen the Judiciary Committee in the headlines a lot in recent months, discussing our efforts to protect the special counsel's investigation, to ensure that Congress receives the complete and unredacted Mueller report, along with all of the underlying evidence, as well as the committee's broader investigation into possible corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power by the President and his administration. That work is vital and worthy of attention, but the press is focused just on a tiny sliver of the work that we are doing as a committee. I want to spend a few moments today first telling you about some of the other stuff the committee is doing and has accomplished so far, and some of the other work that we have ahead of us, not dealing with the investigation of the President. When I first took over as chairman of the committee in January, it seems a long time ago, but it's only January, I thought about a few major themes that could guide the formation of our agenda. First and foremost, in protecting and strengthening the rule of law and democratic institutions. Second, working toward a more just and inclusive society. And finally, broad oversight over the executive branch, not just related to the Russia investigation, but in a variety of ways to hold the President and his administration accountable to Congress and the public. The very first hearing we held this year was on H.R. 1, the so-called For the People Act. As you can imagine from the number, this bill is signature legislation and a major priority for the Democratic caucus. It also goes to the heart of protecting and strengthening democratic institutions, like voting rights and clean and fair elections. It's a comprehensive bill that strengthens voting, campaign finance, lobbying, and government ethics laws in various ways. Right now, more and more political power is being concentrated in fewer and fewer wealthy and powerful hands. Those that do have power are using unfair and anti-democratic means of cementing their hold on power through tactics like voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, and campaign finance laws that allow the wealthy to exert an outsized influence on the political process. I've often said that if we are not careful, the history books may eventually say that, like the Roman Republic, the United States had a good 200 to 250-year run with democracy and then evolved into an oligarchy, just like many other societies. A major, and H.R. 1 is designed in many different ways to prevent that. Another major priority of the Judiciary Committee is to reinvigorate the Voting Rights Act by restoring the Act's most important enforcement mechanism, its preclearance provision. Before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, states and localities would pass voter suppression laws, blatantly discriminatory laws designed to keep black people from voting, secure in the knowledge that it could take many years before the Justice Department could successfully challenge them in court, if at all. As soon as one law was overturned, another would be enacted, essentially setting up a discriminatory game of whack-a-mole, and you never caught up. Preclearance required jurisdictions with a history of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities to submit changes to their voting laws, any changes, change to the law, change to the regulations, moving a precinct voting place across the street. They had to submit this to the Justice Department or to the Federal District Court in Washington for approval prior to taking effect. And this effectively stopped the game of whack-a-mole, and that's why you saw in the South, for instance, black voter registration statistics go from 3 or 4% to 60 or 65% in 4 years. Preclearance, unfortunately, was effectively gutted in 2013 when the Supreme Court issued its disastrous decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which, noting that discrimination was no longer a problem in this country, struck down the formula for determining which states and localities are subject to the preclearance requirement. In its absence, the game of whack-a-mole has returned. North Carolina and Texas announced their intention to reinstate such discriminatory measures just one day after Shelby County was decided. And we've seen many voter suppression measures, many gerrymandering measures enacted since. And the Justice Department, if it has a sympathetic administration, not now, but when there's a sympathetic administration, has to chase this in court. But meanwhile, you hold 2 or 3 or 4 elections with a discriminatory law in effect while you're chasing it. And then when the court finally knocks it down, they enact another law and you start the process over again. The Constitution Subcommittee of Judiciary has already held one hearing to begin the process of building a record to document the need for preclearance, and we will be holding a series of other hearings to build the case. Later this year, I expect that we will advance legislation that will pass the House at least to restore preclearance and to add a variety of other voting rights protections. H.R. 1 includes the Democracy Restoration Act of 2019, which I introduced on the first day of this Congress. This bill would restore federal voting rights for citizens with felony convictions who had served their time. Many states deny voting rights for such citizens, permanently branding them with a scarlet letter long after they have paid their debt to society. Not only is ex-offender disenfranchisement wrong and anti-democratic in and of itself, many of these laws were deliberately designed to entrench white supremacy. And in fact, many of you may have heard of the Glass-Steagall Act. How many people here have heard of the Glass-Steagall Act? Okay. Glass-Steagall Act was a very good law enacted during the New Deal economics. I won't get into it. But it was named after Congressman Steagall and Senator Carter Glass of Virginia. Carter Glass was a New Deal senator who in 1905, 30 years prior to enactment of the Glass-Steagall Act, was a delegate to the Virginia State Constitutional Convention. He was the prime sponsor of the Felony Disenfranchisement Act in Virginia. And he was honest. He got up and said, when we enact this act, the darkies will no longer vote in Virginia. This will ensure white supremacy. So he was honest about the intent. And that was, for many years, and still is very often, the effect. Not only is ex-offender disenfranchisement wrong of itself, but they were deliberately designed to entrench white supremacy, and they continue to have a particularly disproportionate impact on communities of color, exacerbating the racially discriminatory effect of voter suppression measures. And we, as part of H.R. 1, we will repeal this. We will outlaw this nationwide. Along with our work to protect democratic institutions, the Judiciary Committee is also focused on building a just and inclusive society. We recently held a hearing on the Equality Act, which would amend the civil rights laws to prohibit discrimination against LGBT and gender nonconforming Americans by explicitly clarifying the sex discrimination prohibited in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and enforced by effective enforcement mechanisms in that act includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. We held a hearing on that. We will be reporting that bill in early May to the floor. Much of the history of the United States has been a history of expanding the definition of who is understood to be included when the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. When those words were first written, that phrase did not include Black and Latino men. It did not include Native Americans. It did not include women. And it did not include LGBT individuals. The Equality Act builds on 2 centuries of efforts to ensure that everyone is able to participate fully in American society, and that we understand the phrase that all men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence more and more broadly. I expect the committee will mark up this legislation soon and will recommend it to the full House for consideration. As we work to ensure that all American citizens are treated with respect and that their fundamental dignity is recognized, the committee has also recognized that the path toward a just and inclusive society has many bumps along the road. Last week, we held a hearing on hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism. Although 2 of the witnesses invited by the Republicans on the committee attempted to hijack the hearing with inflammatory and baseless claims, we also heard from experts who documented the alarming rise of white nationalism and the violence directed against Black people, against Hispanic people, against Jews, that is the sad result of such bigotry and hatred. The hearing also included discussion of how hate speech is spread online through social media and other online platforms. I pointed out during the hearing that YouTube had to disable the comments function on the live stream of the hearing because it was overrun by racist and ugly comments from white nationalists and others as the hearing was going on. Clearly, this is an issue we will have to continue to work on. The FBI statistics show that an absolute majority of people who have been murdered or injured by racist or other crimes, by hate crimes in this country, have been victims of neo-Nazi or white nationalist groups, not of jihadist groups, not of Black extremist groups, which some people, alleged Black extremist groups, which some people try to focus on. The biggest problem we have in terms of violence today is white nationalist groups. Before I discuss the committee's oversight work, I want to briefly mention some of the important legislative items we've considered this Congress. The first major bill to pass the Judiciary Committee this year was legislation to require universal background checks for guns. The epidemic of gun violence in this country is a national crisis and an international embarrassment. And people don't realize just how bad it is. In 2017, nearly 40,000 Americans lost their lives because of guns. Every day in America, an average of 34 people are murdered with a firearm and more than 183 people injured in a firearm attack. By comparison, In 2011, and keep this comparison in mind, we lose 39,000, 38, 39, 40,000 people a year to gun violence in this country. By comparison, in 2011, the United Kingdom, that is Britain, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, lost 146 people to gun violence. Denmark, 71. Portugal, 142. Japan, 30. The United States, 39,000. The common factor in all of these other countries is that they have stronger gun control laws. H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, would close a dangerous loophole that allows guns to be sold without a background check on the purchaser. The FBI's internal assessment demonstrated that checks processed through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System are approximately 99.3 to 99.8% accurate. And in 90% of the cases, the checks are processed, that is, the background checks are processed within 90 seconds. The bill would save many lives without imposing a significant burden on gun purchases. The bill recently passed the House. I hope the Senate will take it up soon. The House also passed the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, as it is commonly known. VAWA funds a variety of programs to address domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Every year, approximately 7.9 million women are victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, and an average of 3 women are killed every day by a current or former intimate partner. VAWA, which is not gender exclusive, addresses the needs of men and women, children, persons with disabilities, homeless persons, and LGBTQ people, among others. VAWA was first enacted in 1994 and was reauthorized on a bipartisan basis in 2000, 2005, and 2013. Each time the bill was expanded and strengthened, and the current reauthorization does the same. We include additional protections for transgender individuals, expanded jurisdiction of Native American tribal authorities over certain non-Indians, and expanded services for older survivors of abuse. The bill also expands protections against gun violence and domestic abuse situations. Although the bill passed the House, unfortunately, it only passed on a party line vote because the Republicans objected to including protections for transgender people in the bill. I hope the Senate will take it up and the VAWA will continue to have the bipartisan support it has historically received. We also held a hearing on legislation to provide permanent protections, including a path to citizenship for dreamers, that is, people who were brought here as kids illegally, but they were kids when they were brought here, and recipients of temporary protected status known as TPS. I'm sure that all of you know about the Dreamers. The Obama administration provided protection for nearly 800,000 Dreamers through the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, program. But in September 2017, the Trump administration announced the end of DACA, threatening to deport these young people from the only country many of them have ever known. Our immigration laws also authorize the Secretary of Homeland Security to designate countries for TPS in response to armed conflict, natural disaster, or other extraordinary circumstances. Persons from TPS countries in the United States at the time the designation is announced can remain here lawfully for the duration of the designation and can receive work authorization. Several 100,000 foreign nationals from 10 countries currently have TPS. The Trump administration has announced the termination of TPS for 6 countries, representing 98% of TPS recipients currently in the United States. Now, if there were a hurricane and people had to flee and TPS were granted and people could go home again after 6 months or a year, then that would make sense. But once people have been here for 20 years because of civil war back home or because the resources to rebuild were not there, and they have laid down deep roots in the country, it is cruel, not to mention economically counterproductive, to remove people who've been here 20 and 25 years from their communities and from the lives and businesses they have built over the course of decades. Courts have issued multiple injunctions against efforts to terminate DACA and several of the canceled TPS designations. But even if the courts ultimately rule against the administration, DACA and TPS recipients need permanent protections and a path to citizenship, and we will continue to work on this issue. Alongside our legislative efforts, the Judiciary Committee is also engaged in robust oversight over the executive branch. Unfortunately, under the previous majority, there was virtually no oversight over the Trump administration. Now, it's obviously true that throughout American history, when Congress was controlled by the same party as the executive branch, oversight was a little less robust, but it was there, except for the last 2 years, where Congress completely ignored its oversight functions and its duty as an independent branch of government with responsibility for holding the President accountable. As chairman, I have tried to balance our legislative responsibilities with meaningful oversight over a range of issues, including the Trump administration's immoral and unconscionable family separation policy, in which children were separated, were torn from the arms of their mothers at the border, and 2,000 still haven't been returned to their parents. The Department of Justice's decision not to defend the Affordable Care Act against a challenge to its constitutionality in court, even though the legal challenge is laughable on its face, and the Department of Justice has a duty to defend duly enacted laws absent exceptional circumstances, not to mention the catastrophic impact on millions of Americans who rely on the ACA, otherwise known as Obamacare, for health care. The nature and history of the pardon power, including how the pardon power can be abused and what Congress and the courts can do if a president abuses the pardon power. And we've seen this president dangle pardons publicly in the front of potential witnesses and talk about people like Paul Manafort as being stand-up guys, and maybe he'll get a pardon. The scope, and that's an obstruction of justice, by the way, to use the pardon to encourage people, to encourage witnesses not to testify and not to cooperate with government. The scope of the National Emergencies Act, in light of the President's decision to bypass Congress and fund his border wall by declaring a national emergency. And this deserves a little comment. We have a number of emergency laws in the books, the main one dating from 1976. And the purpose of these laws is to give the President flexibility in the event of an emergency. God forbid there's an attack on this country, there's a major natural disaster, whatever. They're designed to give the President some flexibility to move funds around to deal with a temporary and sudden and unexpected emergency. When Congress first enacted this, it provided that the emergency could be undeclared by a joint resolution of Congress at any time. If they thought the President was wrong or was abusing his authority, Congress, by majority vote, could eliminate the emergency. In 1983, unfortunately, the Supreme Court declared such legislative vetoes generally unconstitutional. So in 1985, Congress passed an inadequate substitute, and it said that we could undeclare an emergency by concurrent resolution. Concurrent resolution requires a majority in each house, but the President can veto it, and then you need 2/3 to overcome the veto. Now, as you've noticed, the President declared a national emergency so that he can use funds to build the wall. Now, there is no national emergency that the wall is designed to deal with. The emergency is that Congress refused to vote him the money he wanted for the wall. And so he declared a national emergency to get around the congressional appropriation power and to build and to shift funds from other things to his wall. Congress, by majority vote in both houses, said there's no emergency. The President vetoed it, and of course you couldn't get a 2/3 vote to overcome the veto. So there's a major problem with these emergency laws now, because in effect the President can declare an emergency, use various emergency powers, unless Congress can get 2/3 to say there's no emergency. The balance of powers should be the opposite way around. But in any event, here he is using it to get around the congressional appropriations power. The English fought a civil war in the 1640s to decide that only Parliament could vote money. The king could not spend money without Parliament voting it. We took that over. The President is not supposed to be able to spend money without Congress voting it. The Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except pursuant to an appropriation voted by Congress. This is an end run around that, should be thrown out by the courts, and is a blatant power grab by the presidency. In addition to these oversight matters, the Judiciary Committee has also launched an investigation into threats to the rule of law posed by the administration. And that, I'm sure you've read about and heard about. The investigation breaks down into 3 major areas, and we've not seen the kind of challenges to the rule of law that we are seeing from this president since the Civil War. He is contemptuous of law, and he tries to get around the law in all kinds of ways. So we're looking into three major areas: obstruction of justice, including the possibility of interference by the President and others in a number of criminal investigations, as well as the alleged cover-up of violations of the law; public corruption, including potential violations of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution; conspiracy to violate federal campaign and financial reporting laws; and misuse of official positions for personal gain; and abuses of power, including attacks on the press, the judiciary, and law enforcement agencies, misuse of the pardon power, and other attempts to misuse the power of the presidency. Of course, the top priority right now is to ensure that Congress receives the full, unredacted Mueller report, as well as all of the underlying evidence, as has always been the case in these types of investigations. The report must be delivered to Congress and the public. The House voted 420 to nothing, calling for the public release of the entire report. The President even called for the release to be made public. 2 changes of mind ago. Along with the chairs of 5 other committees, I have written numerous letters to the Attorney General demanding the full release of the report and the underlying evidence to the Congress. Even if information must be redacted for public release, Congress should receive everything. And in every prior investigation, Congress has received everything. Congress decided some things had to be kept from the public because of national security. It might reveal sources and methods of intelligence. It might be too private, but Congress made that decision. Congress had the information. The Attorney General has stated that 4 categories of information must be redacted: grand jury information, classified information, information that may impede an ongoing investigation, and information that affects the privacy and reputational interests of third parties. And by the way, when you add up what is included in these 4 categories, it might be just about everything. Everything could affect the privacy and reputational interests of third parties, like Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr. or whoever. And since Mueller used the grand jury, much of the investigation probably occurred before the grand jury. Some information may legitimately need to be withheld from the public, but there is no excuse from withholding information from Congress. Congress handles classified information every day. That is no excuse for withholding information from Congress. We are also perfectly capable of protecting information that may relate to third parties or ongoing investigations. In the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, the Department of Justice, or rather, I should really say, in the investigation into the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails, and in the investigation into the beginnings of the Mueller investigation, of the investigation of Russian interference in the election, these were 2 investigations for which there is no factual predicate at all, which the Republicans in charge of the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee launched last year. But in those, what I would call unnecessary investigations, but nonetheless they were there, the Department of Justice and the FBI released more than 880,000 pages of documents to the Judiciary and Oversight Committees. Publicly identified career officials involved in the case, produced sensitive and classified materials to the committee, and deliberative records and information related to ongoing investigations. Certainly, if they could produce that to the committees then, they can produce everything in the Mueller report to us now. To the extent that materials are protected by grand jury secrecy rules, Rule 6E of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, the Department can join Congress in requesting that the Court turn the materials over to Congress, as was done during the Watergate affair and in other cases. Congress went to court to get grand jury information while investigating Judge Porteous, Porteous. You've probably never heard of him, but he was impeached in the 1980s. Ken Starr released his entire report to Congress, including grand jury information and 17 boxes of documents. Congress voted to make all of this information public. I opposed that decision because the information included personal and salacious material that had no benefit to being public other than embarrassing President Clinton or embarrassing Monica Lewinsky. I have been accused of being inconsistent, of changing my mind. I have 2 comments. One is permitted to rethink things and change your mind over 21 years. But 2, I didn't. I was entirely consistent because at that time, all the information, all the evidence was given to Congress. The question before us, to which I said no to some things, was whether it should all be made public. Now we're demanding that all the information be delivered to Congress, not that all of it be delivered to the public. As much as possible should be made public, but that decision should be up to Congress, as it has been in the past, not up to the Attorney General. It's also very different types of information. Personal information about the President's sex life should remain private. Information about a sustained attack on the integrity of the Republic by the President and his closest advisors must become public. There is another problem here. The Department of Justice has taken the position for many years, a position I disagree with, that a sitting president is immune from indictment and prosecution. He cannot be indicted as a matter of law. Now, this is untestable. Normally, if there's a legal proposition like that, you can test it. So if the Justice Department says that dropping this paperclip is a crime and decides to indict me for dropping the paperclip, I would then move in court to dismiss the indictment for failure to describe a crime, and I would win. But that's how the question gets to court. The Justice Department indicts somebody, that somebody moves to dismiss the case, and the court decides. But where the Justice Department says we will not prosecute because we don't think we have the power to prosecute, no matter what the evidence, you can't test it. No one else can prosecute. And therefore, no one can get to the point of having a court decide whether the Justice Department is right or not. So the Justice Department simply declares that the President cannot be indicted. Why? Well, because the President heads the executive branch, and indicting the President and taking up his time away from his golf course would burden the administration of the country, would burden the executive branch too much. Now, aside from my wisecrack about the golf course and how much time the President apparently has for such things, there are really two answers to that. Number one, the Constitution is very specific. The President can be impeached by the House. If the President were to be impeached, I guarantee you that would take up a lot of his time. Probably as much time as if he were indicted by the Justice Department. Second of all, the Constitution, when it wants to, the framers of the Constitution, when they wanted to afford specific immunities to officials, knew how to do it. For example, members of Congress cannot be arrested for any crime while on their way to or from Washington. That's right in the Constitution. Why was that done? Because because the King of England sometimes got his way in Parliament by keeping obstreperous members away from the session. You arrested the members, you held them in jail, you passed your bill, and then you let them out. So they didn't want any of that nonsense. Secondly, members of Congress cannot be questioned for anything we say on the floor. Speech and debate clause. These are very specific grants of immunity with respect to members of Congress in the Constitution in so many words. So the framers knew how to write an immunity. If they wanted to say the President could not be indicted, they would have said it. And they didn't. But the Justice Department has said that the President cannot be indicted. I disagree. But if you take that position and then withhold information from Congress, it becomes a cover-up, since Congress remains the only institution that can hold the President accountable. Normally, there's a rule, a good law, or a good rule in most situations, that the Justice Department should not comment negatively on people it declines to indict. If the Justice Department decides to indict so-and-so, they announce it, obviously. If they decide not to indict so-and-so, you normally don't announce it, unless it's a case of public notoriety and this person, everybody knows this person is being considered to be indicted. Then it's only fair you announce that, well, we've investigated and we're not indicting this person, the evidence isn't there. You don't then say, but we think this person is terrible anyway, as Comey did with respect to Hillary Clinton. That was a gross abuse of his power. As a normal rule, that should be the practice. But if you take the position that the President is not being indicted, not because there isn't ample evidence for his indictment, perhaps, but because you think that as a matter of law he can never be indicted no matter how much evidence there is, And then you take the position that, well, he's not indicted, so we're not going to give the public or the Congress any information about him because we don't comment negatively on people we're not indicting, then you've turned a proper safeguard into a total cover-up. And you've also decided, in effect, that not only can the Department of Justice not hold the president accountable because it can't indict him, but we're going to prevent Congress, which has the duty of holding a president accountable, the only institution that does it, the Department of Justice can't, we're going to prevent them from doing it by withholding necessary information. So that is a real problem, and another reason we have to see all the information from the Mueller report and the underlying evidence. Now, the Attorney General, unfortunately, Attorney General Barr seems to be operating as a political actor, not as a law enforcement officer. Special Counsel Mueller spent 22 months investigating the president. Attorney General Barr summarized the 400-page report in 2 pages and cleared the president in 48 hours. We know that the report did not exonerate the president on allegations of obstruction of justice, though it did not charge him either. But Barr announced almost immediately that the president would not be charged, that he decided that. No one gave him the power to decide that. We know from his memo to the department before he became Attorney General, he wrote a lengthy memo before he became Attorney General that said that a president, any president, cannot be charged with obstruction of justice, no matter what he does. Because, he said, the president is the head of the Justice Department. And since he is the head of the Justice Department, as he is of every other department, he can do anything he wants. He can order that you be indicted, not indicted, you be investigated. He can order that you not be investigated. He can cancel an investigation. Since that is the case, any decision he made cannot be a criminal obstruction of justice. Now, that is a radical theory of presidential power. It's not a theory that most lawyers or courts, in fact, any courts that I know of, have ever adhered to. But given that opinion, then obviously he was going to decide, regardless of what evidence Mueller may have had in his report, that the president did not commit obstruction of justice. He has now further called into question his own objectivity, and to me, and to many others, has convinced me that he is not acting as an attorney general, but as the president's private attorney, his private advocate. When he talked to the Senate the other day, and he talked about spying, that the Justice Department spied on the Trump campaign. Now, he had to admit a few paragraphs later that there was no evidence for this, but nonetheless he repeated it. And spying is a loaded word. In fact, what the Justice Department did, the FBI did, was that they opened a counterintelligence investigation to look into Russian interference in the election and and to the extent to which people in the Trump campaign may or may not have been cooperating with the Russians. They had to do that because there was ample evidence of the Russian interference. They had to protect the integrity of our elections. They got a warrant. They got a FISA warrant, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant from the FISA court. That warrant expired after 90 days. They got it renewed 3 times. Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein signed the application for the 3rd renewal. A court decided on that. Court-authorized wiretapping, court-authorized surveillance is not spying. And by his use of that loaded term, which has been used only by right-wing conspiracy theorists and a couple of wacky congressmen until now, he shows where he stands. So he is now raising questions about the integrity of the investigation itself. It's the same playbook Republicans used in the Hillary investigation. If you do not like the conclusions, attack the investigation. I know that the Judiciary Committee's oversight work, especially with respect to the Mueller report, has gotten the most headlines. But we have already had an extremely busy and productive legislative and oversight agenda, separate and apart from the Mueller investigation, and I expect that to continue over the next year and a half. I appreciate the opportunity to talk today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on any of the issues I've just discussed or any other issues that may be on your mind. Yes, sir. The extension of the Voting Rights Act was originally passed in 1965. It was renewed, as I said, in 2000, 2006, and 2013. In 2006, Steve Shabbat and I presided over several hundred hours of hearings. We assembled a 15,000-page record because the Supreme Court told us we needed an extensive record. The vote for extending the Voting Rights Act that year was 395 to 10 or something. There are 435 members, so it's 395 to a tiny number. We are not going to get bipartisan support now. Ever since Shelby County, the Republicans have changed. And the Republicans, as a matter of strategy, have followed a very consistent pattern wherever they have legislative majorities of doing what they can to suppress minority votes. So you've had a steady pattern of not only of every in North Carolina, the court said that the law that they had enacted on voter ID was directed at black people with almost surgical precision, unquote. But so they've had this whole nonsense about voter ID. You know, there is voting fraud in the country. Not much, but there is voter fraud. But there is virtually no personal identification fraud. And voter ID is designed to say, okay, if you turn up at the polls and say you're Joe Schmo and in fact you're Henry Blow, you should have to prove who you are. There's virtually no personal identification fraud. There are other types of fraud, but virtually none of that. But the Republicans have done everything they can in most states, wherever they have a legislative majority, to enact restrictive voter ID laws, to cut out registration campaigns. They just passed a law, and I forget which state, that makes it a felony to gather someone's registration, not turn it in within 10 days, and a misdemeanor to turn it in if it isn't totally accurate. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, if you want to check one way or the other. So no, this is not going to get enacted until we have a Democratic majority in both houses and a president, hopefully in 2 years.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you for defending Representative Omar yesterday against what I see as personally racist and far-right attacks on her. So thank you for that and for standing up for other progressive representatives in the House. Could you talk about your reluctance to use your subpoena power, specifically for, well, both the memo and the full report from Mueller and Barr?
We
but
have
also
no reluctance to use the subpoena power. We will get the report. First of all, we've issued subpoenas to 5 individuals for various reasons. What? This coming Thursday. Well, we will probably allow Thursday or Friday to pass so we can see how much of the report we've gotten, and then we will issue subpoenas. We have not issued them yet because our lawyers tell us that in order to enforce a subpoena, which will be a court fight, you have to do everything you can in advance of issuing a subpoena to provide evidence to the court that we've done everything we can to accomplish this without a subpoena, to accommodate the department, et cetera. That's what we've done. And at this point, since we're talking about a few days, we'll wait for it to be issued. Maybe we'll take a day or two to see if we got 90% of what we wanted or not. If we didn't, we will issue that subpoenas.
Good afternoon. Oh, so sorry. Good afternoon, Congressman. When you came in the fall first, you predicted that the House Ways and Means Committee was going to request Donald Trump's tax returns, and you were right. Chairman Neal did that, but now he's being met with backlash. So do you have any insight on how that's going to unfold?
Well, he's not being met with backlash. He's being met with defiance by the Justice Department, by the Treasury Department. Now, the statute is very clear. It says, upon request by the chairman of the, not by the chairman, they voted it, by the committee. Upon request by the committee, or maybe by the chairman, I forget which, but whichever, they did it. The IRS shall provide. The administration is first of all, they bucked it up to the Secretary of the Treasury, who is on top of the IRS commissioner. Chairman Neal notably wrote yesterday to the IRS, not to the Treasury Secretary, and they're saying, well, you know, you have to have a legislative purpose, blah, blah. They're lawless. They're just defying the law. Chairman Neal is going to go to court. The problem is it may take the courts, by the time it gets up to this, they'll fight it up to the Supreme Court. It may take quite a while. And that's the basic problem we have, not only with that, but with subpoenas, too. When we issue the subpoena, I am sure that they will oppose it in court, and I don't know how long it'll take to get it. It'll probably go up to the Supreme Court. Now, we should win in the Supreme Court. I mean, the worst case scenario, or the worst case, was the Nixon case, because the tapes were, if anything is privileged, those tapes were privileged. They were the actual conversation of the President of the United States, the strongest possible claim for privilege, and the Supreme Court said, no, you must give it up. The vote was 8-0. We may very well find out whether we have a conservative Supreme Court, which should follow precedent and order the material released to us and order the tax returns released to Ways and Means, or a partisan Supreme Court. If we have a partisan Supreme Court in which they're not looking at the law but only at the politics, we may, you know, we'll see what could happen. That would tell us a lot. Any nonpartisan court, there's no question about the application of that statute. There are all kinds of, you pick somebody.
Do you anticipate calling Mr. Mueller to
Mr. who?
testify?
Mueller?
Mueller?
Yes.
You do?
Yes, I'm sure we will. We'll want to see the report first, obviously, because what we see in the report will help guide what questions you want to ask him. But I do anticipate Mueller testifying, and I do anticipate there are a number of people. What was very notable was that for 22 months there were no leaks at all. No leaks. Nothing came out of the investigation except what was filed in court papers. Since Barr released his memo, there have been leaks to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, by various people from the Mueller investigation saying that's not representative, et cetera. In other words, they were so angry and frustrated by what they saw coming out of Mueller that they were motivated to have leaks. I anticipate that in addition to Mueller, we'll want to call those people.
I have just one other question. I had heard that the Mueller team had put together not only the 400-some-odd page report, but a couple of other reports were redacted already.
Well, what they put together, reportedly, none of this is official, but what we hear they put together, what's been reported in the press, is that there were summaries of various parts of the report put together and designed to be rapidly releasable. In other words, either no redactions necessary or only very obvious redactions and minor redactions. That we hear that was done, and one of the frustrations that we're hearing is that Barr should have published those. Now, the administration is putting out propaganda to the effect that the Justice Department said that every page had a stamp on it that said there may be classified material here. That doesn't mean that can't be very quickly vetted and released, period. So yes, there were such, we hear, I mean, I can't swear to it, but the press has reported, and we've been told that there are such summaries of various sections of the report that were made, and if we don't see them, we'll certainly subpoena them.
Thank you, Congressman Nadler, for your incredibly intelligent and diligent work that you've done your entire congressional life. Is there any opportunity that you see that, assuming the Congress passes any of the initiatives that you've currently discussed, that even if Congress passes them, that you will have any crossover votes from potentially slightly less conservative senators to actually enact any of the things that you're doing into law?
Well, some of the things, yes. We may have some further criminal justice reform on top of what we did last year. That's possible. I didn't mention, but I think there's a good chance we will have bipartisan passage of legalizing marijuana. I'm going to introduce that bill in early May. It will pass the House, and I think there's a fair chance it pass the Senate. Some of the other stuff, we may reach a compromise on some immigration stuff. I hope we do. We have to do something on the Dreamers and the TPS. The question is what price they'll want us to pay and whether it's a price we can pay. There's certain things we cannot do on immigration that we will not do, we should not do.
Hi, Congressman, thank you. My question is in two parts. One, why do we need the Voting Rights Act when we have the 14th and the 19th Amendment? And second, why is it renewable every 25 years?
We need the Voting Rights Act because even under the 14th Amendment, they were getting away with murder. I mean, the 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868, and African American people, for instance, were basically kept from voting in the South and in various other jurisdictions until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. There are a lot of things a state can do which a court may hold doesn't violate the Voting Rights Act, which the 14th Amendment, which in fact, and maybe it facially doesn't. For example, well, look at some of what was done in this election. In North Dakota, the North Dakota legislature passed a law that said that in registering to vote, you had to give your street address. Sounds reasonable, except for Indian reservations, which don't have street addresses. Indian reservations tend to vote Democratic, so there was a good, logical, justifiable reason for keeping them from voting. There was this the famous case, this was on TV every night, at college in, I think, Arkansas or Kansas, a big college, 10,000 kids or something, and they moved the voting place from campus to a place a mere 3 miles away that was inaccessible by public transportation. They got away with that. There are a lot of things you can do. For another example, I may think that having a city council that consists of 20 people elected from 20 districts is wasteful. Why not have 10 members elected at large, which means your black population or your Hispanic population that's only 40%, instead of electing 40% of the members if they want, elect 0, because it's buried in a larger area. So there are many, many ways of preventing people from voting or having proper voting influence that people have gotten away with. Now, the Voting Rights Act is possible because of the 14th Amendment. That is, the authority to enact it comes from the power to enforce the 14th Amendment. Without the 14th Amendment, we couldn't do it, because elections are local and the Constitution doesn't give us that power, but the 14th Amendment, we can do that. And that, by the way, it's another discussion, but why did the pre-clearance requirements affect only some states? Why not make it uniform? Well, because that would give us constitutional problems that probably wouldn't be solved by the 14th Amendment.
Jerry, thank you very much for really bringing back oversight and, intelligence and honesty to our the Judiciary Committee. During the Brett Kavanaugh nomination and review, there were some comments made about returning to that process that took place and investigating him. And I wonder, on your very long list of to-do, whether we're ever going to go back and look at who this man is and whether there's a possibility of impeaching him.
Yes and maybe. We will get to one thing, whether the other thing I'm not sure. What we will get to is that you may recall that there was an FBI background check done and that was done not sloppily, totally inadequately. Chief complainants were not interviewed. 20 or 30 witnesses said, "Here I am, interview me." We're not interviewed, et cetera. And that was because either the White House or the Senate majority told them to be very what not to do. So we will certainly look into that. When we'll get to it, I don't know. But one of the things on the to-do list is certainly look into that and change the law, hopefully, so that a background check is a real background check, so that they can't, so that some political force, whether emanating from the Justice Department or the Senate or wherever, cannot squelch a proper background check. Whether we'll get beyond that to look at Kavanaugh, I don't know. We've got a president to deal with first. Beyond that, it may be. Now, there's another thing. Kavanaugh was the subject of many ethics, I think about 50 ethics, not indictments, 50 ethics accusations, and they were being investigated. When he was confirmed to the Supreme Court, that stopped because the federal judiciary has authority to investigate ethics allegations against all federal judges except Supreme Court judges. That's something we should probably change. And that change might get back to Kavanaugh.
Thank you so much for coming today on behalf of all the students. With the rise of left-wing populism in the United States, what type of impact will you believe that these rise of insurgent Democrats are going to have on the Democratic Party going forward?
That's very difficult to say, but before I answer that, let me put it into perspective too. We've got 3 or 4 members of Congress who are getting a lot of publicity, and they're very left-wing, if you want to call it that. But remember, we elected 63 new members, 63 new Democratic members, 42 of whom took over Republican districts. I guarantee you the 42 who took over Republican districts aren't left-wing radicals. They would not get elected in those districts. So the weight of the party has not really shifted at all. I shouldn't say at all. Has not really shifted. You have a few voices which are very left-wing voices, which command a lot of attention, but you have a lot of people who are saying, hey, you know, in my district I got to win this way, I can't do it that way. So I'm not sure how much that is. Now, the publicity itself obviously is a major factor. We'll see how the Democratic nominees or the potential Democratic nominees react. But the reality is, in most elections, in presidential years, what Jerry Nadler says, or what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, or even what Nancy Pelosi says, doesn't represent the Democratic Party. What represents the Democratic Party is whatever the presidential nominee says. We don't know who that nominee is yet. But eventually there will be one nominee, and that person will set the tone and the image of the Democrats to a very large extent. Not totally, but 80%. And we don't know what that's going to be yet. Now, there are divisions in the party. I think the divisions are exaggerated. But if people are not willing to, and again, a lot of this can be put off to the next administration, but I'll give you one example. If people are not willing to compromise and are going to stand firm in their own things, no matter what, then you're going to have problems. And let me give one obvious example, Medicare for All. Medicare for All is basically a single payer system. Now, there are 3 ways of organizing medical care. You can have straight socialist medicine, in which the doctors are on the government payroll. We have that. It's called the Veterans Administration, straight socialist system. Or you can have a single payer system, in which basically you go to a private doctor. The doctor is private, but you send the bill to the government. Single payer. That's why they call it single payer. We have 2 separate single payer systems in the United States. One is called Medicare. One is called Medicaid. Medicare is a much better system than Medicaid, essentially because we've decided to spend more money on it per patient. You can write a very good Medicare, a very good single-payer system. You can write a pretty bad single-payer system. Just saying it's single-payer doesn't answer your question. You got to know a lot about it. And if you wanted to see that, look at the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, for example. And the third way of organizing it is multiple payer. You go to the doctor, private doctor, and you send your bill to some private insurance company. And again, you can make that fairly decent. I think you can make a single payer system much better than you can make a multiple payer system, but you can make a pretty good multiple payer system if you're willing to spend enough money. And you can make a very lousy multiple payer system. Now, Medicare for all implies a single payer system. Everybody's on Medicare. I've co-sponsored the single payer bill every year I've been in Congress. And I think it's a more efficient, effective means of supplying medical care for a very simple reason. You don't have to waste all the money that is wasted in the multiple payer system on marketing, on advertising, on cherry picking the market, et cetera. So Medicare, the single payer system can be the most efficient of all. On the other hand, you can make a pretty efficient multiple payer system too, although more expensive. If we learned anything from Obamacare, from the battle over Obamacare. Now, what was Obamacare, by the way? Obamacare was improving a multiple payer system and extending Medicaid to a lot of people who didn't have it before. We didn't get the public option, which would have permitted people to buy into Medicare, unfortunately. But if we learned anything from the political fight over Obamacare and over the last 10 years, it should be that there's one thing you cannot do. You cannot tell millions of people who like their insurance, who have insurance, let's say, from their employer, and they have a policy from wherever. You cannot tell them, even though you like your insurance, we're going to take it away from you. But don't worry, we're going to give you something better. We're going to so improve Medicare, or whatever we'll call it, that it'll be better than what you have, so don't worry about it. But you have no choice. You're going to lose what you have now, but we'll give you something better. You try that, and tens of millions of people will have your head. And when you look at the polls, and the Medicare for All polls very well, until you say to people that that means, among other things, you can't keep your insurance system even if you want it, and all of a sudden it plunges. So there are various proposals, which maybe a victorious Democratic presidential candidate will take up, and maybe a Democratic Congress would force, who knows. There are various types of proposals that says, okay, you like your insurance, keep it. But we will allow anybody to buy into Medicare. Don't have to be 65, you don't have to be 25. Anybody can buy into Medicare. Government will pay the premium, or maybe the government will pay a subsidy on a sliding scale for the premium, but you can buy into Medicare, as you can buy from a private insurance company. You can buy from insurance company A, you can buy from insurance company B, or you can buy it from Medicare. The employer, who is required by law, if he's a large employer, to provide medical insurance that meets certain basic standards, that's one of the points of Obamacare, can buy it from insurance company A, group policy, or a group policy from insurance company B, or from Medicare. And if you did that, you could call that Medicare for All, or you could call it Medicare for All who want it. It would be a very good system, and you would have a much better chance of enacting it than if you tried to do Medicare for All, whether people wanted it or not. Now, if those of us who've always supported single-payer medical care are right, if we are right that a single-payer system is inherently more efficient, and therefore you can provide a better care, more cheaply, or for the same money, better care, or for less money, same care, whatever. If we are right, then experience will prove that, and people will gradually move into Medicare, and eventually it'll become a long time, but eventually it'll become all single payer. If we're wrong, we'll find that out too. I don't think we're wrong. But there is the potential, and I hope it doesn't happen, there is the potential for people in the party getting on high horses, on two high horses. High horse one, you cannot force I'm not going to vote for my constituents to tell them they have to give up their private insurance companies, because that would be suicide in my district. High horse two, Medicare for All means Medicare for all. It means everybody's on Medicare. We're closing down the private insurance industry. If people get up on those two high horses, then we'll have a real problem, and you probably won't enact anything. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope, first of all, we have a Democratic majority in both houses and the president, so we face that problem. But At that point, we'll need some sort of compromise or melding of the systems. And I hope the campaign doesn't develop into a system where it's a litmus test, either for Medicare for all and cutting out all the insurance companies, or you're not. And if you're not, you're not a true progressive. That may happen. I don't see any other issue really where that kind of division might happen. Every Democrat is going to support rather drastic action on climate change, whether you call it a Green New Deal or you call it something else. Everybody's going to be aboard. I can't think of other major issues. Everybody's going to be aboard major infrastructure programs, et cetera. Yeah.
Do you have any concern for the sheer number? Do you have any concern? First of all, thank you very much. Okay, I've learned a lot. Do you have any concern about the sheer number of Democrats that have announced their candidacy? And okay, what will happen as you progress down the path, the competitive nature of what occurs, that this may end up into like a free-for-all?
I don't think so. I don't have real worry. You only have 22 candidates at the moment, or 20, whatever it is. I think it'll narrow itself pretty quickly. I mean, it'll narrow itself. Remember, we're a year almost from the first caucus. There was an interesting article I think it was in the Times the other day or yesterday, that the incentives have shifted. And there are all kinds of incentives to run for president, even if you have a very low level of winning and no incentive. But I think people are going to see who's a serious candidate, not in their own mind, but in terms of the ability to win, fairly rapidly. Look at the Republicans 4 years ago. They had 17 candidates. They came up with the worst one, but the fact is they came up with one candidate. It didn't stop them from winning. I think we'll end up, I mean, the worst case scenario, if you want to call it worst case, I don't know if it's worst case. It's an interesting political science question. In all likelihood, and certainly this has been true every year since 1956, and certainly since we changed the rules in 1968, after 68, to provide for primaries and so forth, someone emerges with a majority before the convention, and you know going into the convention who's going to be the nominee. Every single case since 1972, since 68, in fact. If you have enough candidates who stick around long enough, so maybe you have a convention where you go in with 2 or 3 candidates. Is that the worst thing in the world? I don't know.
Anyway, please join me in thanking Congressman Jerry Nadler. Let me remind our students that you're all invited to lunch with the congressman on the 3rd floor, so you can go up now. And the rest of our guests, thank you.